Blessed love and welcome to Things You Will Ignore in Florida History, hosted by Mr. Peterson, aka Coach Pete. This is Phase 4, Indian Country. Cultures clash on the prairie. Now, the last unit when we talked about From Great Experiment to Jackson's White Republic, we read a New Zealand article that spoke about how Jacksonian democracy was great for the common man, but only if the common man was white. So it was a uniting force, this Jacksonian democracy, for white men, right? Because then they were allowed to participate in the political process. The democratic reforms achieved by the working class whites came at the direct expense of free blacks. The Jacksonian justification for expanding into the new territory assumed that Native Americans and Hispanics were lesser peoples. So that's important that we remember that. Note that we learned from the last unit, and now that we're talking more so about Indian country, which is the westward expansion. All right, so when we think about this area that is westward, that is being expanded into by the United States, it's referred to as the Great Plains. All right, so you can look at the map there and you can see the different states, but you can also see the indigenous people, the tribes that were already there. Here's a clearer picture of the actual state. So when we look at the Cheyenne, for example, we can see that they were inhabitants of what we call Wyoming now. Okay, so as we look at this map, we see that it's not just talking about the Indian Removal Act that was enacted by Andrew Jackson and his administration, removing Seminoles from Florida and relocating them to Indian Territory, Oklahoma. But also through this map we can see how other tribes were subsequently moved and removed from their lands, as this was the policy of the administration. This was the government that was actively removing people, native people, from the land so that these white settlers, these settler colonialists, could inhabit more and more land, more and more territory. So the Great Plains. When we think of the Great Plains, what we're thinking about is the grassland that extends through the west central portion of the United States. Now, after the Spanish brought horses to New Mexico in 1598, life for the indigenous people of America changed dramatically. As they acquired horses and then guns, their methods of travel and hunting became more effective. Indigenous people of the plains, also called Plains Indians, they depended on buffalo. All right, its meat was food and its hide or skins were used for clothing, shoes, blankets, and teepees. So let's get back to how the United States government and the policies towards Native American people in understanding uh, how the presidents that were elected after Andrew Jackson, right? Part of the reason why they were elected was because they emulated Andrew Jackson, all right? Either that or he flat out endorsed him. With both cases, though, what was really glorified and romanticized was his trait of Indian fighting, right? And this was something that the white man, notice how we talked about how the Jacksons' white republic, it was something that was a unifying force for them under the mantra of white supremacy, right? These white men felt like it was their manifest destiny to inhabit land that was these savages were already here. But we've also dispelled that myth earlier in our class by looking at the example of Cahokia and the many other examples of civilization that was already here. However, because of that perspective, that white supremacy perspective, that civilization was not acknowledged, right? It wasn't looked at as being as important. And so these presidents that came after Andrew Jackson, they continued this policy. So the railroad allowed white settlers to move westward to acquire land. This approach that land was a commodity to be owned was much different to the indigenous mindset and way of life. This expansion influenced the government's policies towards Native Americans. In 1834, the federal government had designated the entire Great Plains as one gigantic reservation. In the 1850s, the government wanted more land for railroads, so it created treaties that defined specific boundaries for each indigenous nation, thus taking more land. In 1864, the Cheyenne returned to their land at Colorado's Sand Creek, assuming that they were under the protection of the government. The command was given for the U.S. Army to slaughter the Cheyenne, and the order was carried out on November 29, 1864. Over 150 residents, mostly women and children, were killed. So let's also look at some of these dates. 1834, all right? That is before the Civil War. So before the Civil War, the Great Plains were just one gigantic reservation. And then by 1864, the Civil War still is not ended, all right? The government, while fighting the Union, quote unquote, fighting the Confederate States, the South, is also actively involved in westward expansion and slaughtering Native Americans. Native Americans resisted along the Bozeman Trail, which ran through the Big Horn Mountain. Crazy Horse defeated Captain Fetterman in the Battle of the 100 Slain, or Fetterman Massacre. With the Treaty of Fort Laramie, the U.S. government agreed to close the Bozeman Trail while the Sioux were forced to live on a reservation along the Missouri River in 1868. So this is a few years after the Civil War. Sitting Bull, a leader of the Sioux, did not sign the treaty and expected to continue to use their traditional hunting grounds. Crazy Horse, Gall, and Sitting Bull led the Sioux and the Cheyenne to victory at Little Bighorn River, defeating Colonel Custer and the 7th Cavalry. This was in 1876. Reformers who were sympathetic to Native Americans supported the idea of assimilation, where Native peoples gave up their beliefs and way of life to become part of white culture. Schools were built for Native Americans to be Americanized. Once again, this ideology, as I told you before, this European activism, that mindset, right? White supremacy is part of that European activism. And here you have schools being built from Native Americans for them to learn how to be civilized, learn how to be American. The destruction of the buffalo was devastating to tribal life on the plains. Buffalo hunters helped to destroy the plains Indians' main source of food, clothing, shelter, and fuel. So part of changing and assimilating these Native Americans, it also was part of destroying their culture, and this was something that was done deliberately. Destroying the buffalo meant destroying the way of life for Native peoples of the plains. All right, and continuing to look at the U.S. government and their policies towards Native Americans, let's take a look at the Dawes Act of 1887. which authorized the President of the United States to survey American Indian tribal land and divide it into allotments for individual Native Americans. In order to convince Native Americans to relocate and claim to the land, the government offered an incentive, citizenship. In order to earn U.S. citizenship, Native Americans would have to accept the allotments and live separately from their tribes, tending their property on their own. So they had to give up their way of life. See, this idea of being Americanized, of being more civilized. So the ways that they had been taught before by their grandmothers and grandfathers, by their ancestors, these things that were practiced were supposed to be forgotten, right? It's another way of destroying a people. A ritual called the ghost dance was performed by the Sioux in hopes that their way of life would be restored. See, not all indigenous people were willing to give up their way of life. And so this movement of the ghost dance spread among 25,000 Sioux on the Dakota reservation. U.S. military leaders were alarmed, and Sitting Bull was ordered to be arrested. He was killed by the police. 350 Sioux were rounded up and taken to a camp. Demands were made for the Indians' weapons. A shot was fired, and nearly 300 unarmed Sioux were slaughtered. The U.S. soldiers left the corpses of the dead Native Americans to freeze on the ground. This entire event is called the Battle of Wounded Knee. However, there was no battle. This was the genocide. This was a massacre. Now, in the completion of history, remember that truth is not about being right or wrong. It is more about being complete or incomplete. There's often things that are left out or not considered. And so I want us to consider the idea of the Buffalo Soldier. Now, Bob Marley brought light of the Buffalo Soldier through a popular song, Buffalo Soldier, Dreadlock Rasta. There was a Buffalo Soldier in the heart of America, stolen from Africa, brought to America. We've heard the song, we know it, we see the lyrics. But what did the Buffalo Soldiers do? The Buffalo Soldiers, they fought Native Americans for the United States in the West, right? So as African Americans joined the army to fight for freedom, for their own freedom, right? The United States also used these soldiers, right? Instead of fighting the South, they were shipped out to fight Native Americans, to clear out Native Americans, so that they could map the unexplored land in the West for the U.S. So these Buffalo Soldiers, all right, destroyed the buffalo, destroyed Native Americans. In fact, they were given that name, Buffalo Soldier, by the indigenous people of the Great Plains. And the third thing that the Buffalo Soldiers did was they opened up the West for white settlers. They also protected these settlements, all right? So they protected the settlements from outside forces, from Native Americans coming back to get their lands. KRS-One had a song called Black Cop, right? Cops, what do? They protect the neighborhoods, right? And here you have these Buffalo Soldiers protecting the settlements of these white settlers, right? So as we look at history and our ideas to tell the truth, to be complete, we also have to consider this idea of the Buffalo Soldier. We also have to understand the role that African Americans played in the genocide of Native American peoples, not just to point fingers for blame, so that we can have some sort of healing through amnesty. Here is your waive it for this unit. It's going to be on the Dawes Act, but I'll show you that a little bit later. This has been another production from one of the dopest teachers ever, Mr. Peterson, aka Coach Pete. Blessed love.